Hello again, everybody, and welcome back. My name is Will Tarashuk, the founder of Ambiguous Podcast Solutions. This is the APS Introduction to Podcast series. Today, we are talking all about show structure, meaning I'm going to tell you about hosts and guests and co-hosts, how to pick a discussion topic, length of your podcast, how long that should be. It's always a hot topic to debate on the internet. How to pick a podcast names, the do's and don'ts of that, and a logo, color structure, text structure, and how that can affect your lower thirds and your graphics package, as well as your website. So all that fun stuff. Podcast descriptions, calls to action placement, meaning advertisements, lower thirds, all of that and more. So it's very exciting. I am joined by, of course, the man behind the board, Christian Wright, the founder of Cube Recording Studios. Christian,
how we doing, man? How we doing today?
Are you ready? Last week was a lot of fun. It was all the It's the intro, 45 minutes of, hey, here's what a podcast is. So today we're probably going to do another 45 minutes.
Dive a little bit deeper. So now we touch the surface. Now it's time to scratch and get a little bit deeper. So let's just jump head first right into it with hosts and guests. If you're going to have a podcast, it's very important to decide who is going to host. Are you going to have guests? Are you going to have a co-host? You know, these are questions you need to answer for yourself before you buy any equipment, before you start recording, before you release anything. This should be like, once you get the idea of, I want to start a podcast, this pretty much be the first thing you should think of. Who's going to host? So, the main host. The main host is the most important part of the podcast. Most successful podcasts have one host who take the lead. That can be a solo show. That can be an interview show. That can be a panel or a co-host, and you have an interview or whatever you want to do. So the key things to look out in a main host. They guide the co-host. They guide the guests through the podcast. They also guide your audience through the entire show. They are taking lead. They are the leader. They are the forerunner. They are what I do on this podcast. Also the staller to get their thoughts together, part of the podcast. This is the most important character in your podcast. And I say the word character because end of the day, podcasts are entertainment. And they're informative. Remember, the P stands for personal, professional. But that main host, that first mic as an industry term, is your guide through the safari of the podcast. There, everything falls on your shoulders. This person should be comfortable behind the mic and confident in their abilities to lead the show and create quality content. At first, I was not the best lead, but it's something I got better at. Some people are going to be really good at it. Some people, honestly, are better as a number two. And that's not a bad thing. You know, some people aren't cut out to be the first mic, and that's just totally fine. It's got to figure out, is that you? And sometimes you don't know until you practice. Another thing a main host can be is doing solo shows. Solo shows, easy for me to say, in my opinion, are tough. At least for me. I am not good at doing solo shows, which is why I asked Christian to hop on this podcast with me, because otherwise it would be me rambling for 45 minutes. It would be good to have someone to bounce off of. So I'm not good at solo shows, but some people really are. Dan Carlin is an excellent solo show podcaster. He does hardcore history. He talks for like 4.5 hours. I'm going to mention a little more about him later. But as a listener, at least for me, it can be a little hard to pay attention to a one-on-one conversation. But it's possible. Because for me, it's just like I zone out. My mind just kind of goes off into the weeds while someone's talking about, whatever. But it's solely something you can do. It's totally something you can be prepared for. But you got to also find creative ways to keep your audience's attention. You can do quick bits. Just a quick 3-4 minute segments, and you go to a quick break, right? It's just kind of keep the audience on your toes. You can put a music bed underneath to kind of keep the audience engaged that way, although you got to be careful there because there are copyrights with music. But yeah, main host, bottom line, be confident behind the mic. Hopefully it's someone who's done it before. And if you do want to start a podcast, it doesn't have to be you. You can hire someone to host your podcast. If you want me to host your podcast, I'll do it. Just reach out to me. We're at apspodcast.com. I'd love to host your podcast. It's kind of what I do. Christian, any thoughts on the main host? No, I think to be a main host, you really do have to be able to captivate, have your words together, be concise, depending on the topic, be funny. If it's serious, be interesting. And these are all the things that, what it means to be, the first mic, the host.
Yeah.
And then there are others who are good at kind of expanding upon other people's ideas.
And, that's where co-host comes in.
And that is the co-host.
Or maybe you have two powerhouses. So, there's that too.
Yeah, you could have two co-hosts. It's kind of like the 1A and 1B. I mean, there is still the 1A. Like for the Kings of the Rings, Ricky and I, friend of the show, Ricky, King Ricky, we both kind of take lead sometimes, but he is the 1A and I am the 1B, where I can ask questions. I can take a lead of a segment, but he decides when we move on and when we stick tight on a certain podcast. So you got to know your structure inside and out. And from a guest perspective, they're looking on you to tell them what to do, right? They're looking on you to change the subject. A guest is there as a guest. They're there just to answer your questions, have some fun, but it does fall on you. Now, Christian, you can even talk to this on Talking with Tarashuk, with the Unnamed Nonsense edition. Sometimes if we're rambling or we kind of have nothing to say, I'll just randomly go, let's ask another question. Right? Because you can tell. You kind of get that sixth sense as a host to know when it's time to move on. Like right now.
And in times where, maybe you've said everything you've had to say, but there's some could potentially be some awkward silence. That's where the co-host can also, come in and fill in and add the color and keep it interesting and keep it fresh.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and if you are doing an interview show as a first mic, you gotta know when to cut off a guest, right? You gotta know when to.
You gotta take control.
You gotta take control because, say you want to do a 30-minute podcast, and you ask the first question. Next thing you know, it's 12 minutes into the podcast, and you even ask the second question. Sometimes that's fine, depending what they're talking about. But sometimes it's like, listen, man, I got stuff I want to talk to you about. Like, just cut them off and move on. But co-hosts, let's talk about co-hosts. So co-hosts also add a lot of value. I love having co-hosts. Talking to Tarashuk needs Christian behind the board. It's someone for me to bounce ideas off of. Right? That's huge. Even if I do have a guest, like there's been some podcasts where I have a guest in here, where I'm gonna want Christian on the podcast because I know he'll add something that I can't add. He adds a different perspective to what I couldn't bring. So if I'm here talking to, I don't know, a dentist on the podcast in studio, I'm like, hey, Christian, do you have any questions for this guy? And he can be like, you know what? I've always wanted to ask him this. I'm like, great. Hop on. We can be a co-host. And it'll be me and you can interview him. I still take lead, but you take that role as a co-host, even with the guest.
Absolutely.
So, Christian, what's your experience as a co-host when we do unnamed nonsense? Like, what do you? Like, I want to say you're the engineer. Right, you got a bigger role. You're the engineer. You do the cuts. You do the Google searches. You ask the questions.
Yeah.
But like, what do you think your biggest responsibility as a co-host is?
Biggest responsibility as a co-host. So, I mean, I think you gotta be on point.
Yeah.
In times like this, like say, what do you think about this? And then I go, that's pretty well said. I think that's about it. If I do that enough times, it's like, well, why am I even here?
Right.
I got to be able to bring something to the table. And I think with you and I, we have a pretty good dynamic because you're a little bit more wild and out there, and I'm a little bit more, laid back and cool. So, it gives a different perspective, and we have a certain chemistry that works. Two different personalities, and I think that's what keeps it fresh. So, I mean, I think you got to bring something to the table.
Yeah.
You don't have to take the lead as much as the main host, of course, co-host. But you got to bring something to the table. Some different flavor. You gotta be interested. You have to be engaged, almost as much, but not just as much. But I think that's an important thing. You do have to bring something to the table.
And even some podcasts have a third mic. Again, King's Wings podcast. It's me, Ricky, and Kay Murphy. Kay Murphy is the third mic. Sometimes it's kind of sorry, Kay, speak when spoken to. And, sometimes they'll want to jump in and have a great point, and they add a phenomenal point, which is why Kay is an excellent third mic, because they are sometimes just the cherry on top to a great conversation.
Some of our best unnamed nonsense segments we had a guest.
Yeah.
It was you and I. We had our chemistry, but then we have a third unpredictable factor on unnamed nonsense, and that's exactly what we need for a show like that, or a lot of different shows. Someone to just give their input, the peanut gallery, so to speak. The guest isn't the peanut gallery, of course, because they're on here and we're asking them questions, but just a third perspective.
And sometimes you're going to have a bad co-host.
I had a co-host my very first podcast. He was my first, also named Christian, not this Christian.
Oh,
Also named Christian. A friend from high school. It was actually his idea.
not me.
Not you.
Not me.
Not you. You actually have already lasted longer than that, Christian.
Yeah, I'm trying. I'm doing my thing. But just get into podcasting. But you get comfortable.
He
quickly.
was an awful co-host. Like
You gonna send him a link to this episode?
I am. I'm gonna cut it and then send it right to his doorstep. I'm gonna make it a VHS tape.
Telegram,
right? I'm like, boop, 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 Morse code. Like, you suck. But he was awful.
You make him do all that work just to find out that it says you suck.
that he's awful. But also, it was also my first podcast, so I take some of the blame because I tried, man. I would throw him something and he just wasn't prepared. He had nothing to say. Let's talk about wrestling, right? So I was like,
oh yeah, that's me. There's been times where there were topics that I didn't have a big background in, but you gotta contribute where you can.
And sometimes you gotta make it up.
Even if you don't know, contribute where you can. Say something stupid. You know, whatever. Say something.
Something. Like, I remember there was this time where I was at the middle of the podcast, like, Christian, not you, other Christian. It's like, Christian, did you even watch Raw this week? Monday Night Raw wrestling? He's like, no, I didn't. And I was like, well, we got nothing to talk about then. You didn't watch the show we're actually covering. So
didn't do his homework.
He wasn't prepared. And eventually he just stopped showing up. And then I tried doing a solo show a little after that. And then I had another co-host. And, it was fine. Me and him had natural chemistry because we're really good friends in real life.
Right.
But even so, then there is something missing. We were always talking over each other. And Chris, sometimes I talk over you. I try to cut in. Sometimes I need to learn how to zip it, which is another thing that's important as a host and co-host. You got to know when to listen as well as when to talk. But then we brought in Ricky, and the King's Rings podcast just took off from there, and it was all fun and games. But, it takes some time to build chemistry, and you got to give it that time. And you also got to know when to
I would say that when we first start off, like, in my opinion, we had to work up to it.
Yeah.
It took a couple episodes.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think potentially the bottom line here is try to have that chemistry.
Yeah.
Work it out. Go through your test different hosts and co-hosts out. And if it's a good friend, then you probably already naturally have that chemistry.
Yeah.
Probably.
Honestly, some of your hosts might turn to be one of your listeners, right? Like, say you have a co-host and they need to leave the podcast for some reason. They got a new job, or they get sick, God forbid. Or they're just like, listen, man, I'm sick of podcasting. I'm done. And you want to fill that void. That's where Kay Murphy came in. They were a fan. They were someone we had a guest on the show. And Ricky and I did tryouts. And eventually we had them on. Now here they are 3 years later. Maybe it's 4 years. I think it's 3 years. I don't know. I have to ask them. But yeah, you never know where a host will come in. And again, or you can go solo. It's completely up to you. And sometimes you could do your solo show, but every now and then you have a reoccurring host. Like, you could, like, once a month, we're going to have a co-host in here, and the rest are going to be my solo, right? You can mix and match whatever you want to do here. Let's talk about guests. Guests are great, in my opinion, always recommended. So let's talk about how to find guests. Because if you are going to host your podcast as a business, you are whatever, you got to find guests. So how are you going to do that? Use your network. Use your social network. Let's go with the business analogy here.
I was just asking about this, because you are constantly interviewing, somewhat pretty important people, and this is I'm glad we're talking about this now, so you could dive into that a little bit.
I mean, sometimes they find me, man,
and that's but see, that's the power of networking.
Yeah,
when people start finding you, it's not outbound cold calls. People are calling you, emailing you, and asking, like, okay, I've seen some of your stuff.
Yeah.
How do we set this up?
Yeah, at least for Talking with Tarashuk, I have had so far 2 people ask to be on my podcast, and to me, it's the most flattering thing ever. And of course, I'm not going to say no because I know them personally, and they're great people. But how to find guests? You use your network. I used my boss. I interviewed my boss on my podcast, which was one of the weirdest things I've ever done. It was one of the most nervous I've ever been for a podcast, but it was one of my favorite episodes.
I didn't know that was your first time, in that situation.
Yeah, I've never actually interviewed someone like I worked with.
Yeah.
Michael was also an interesting one. My cousin Michael, because he's my cousin. I never interviewed a family member. I never really had friends on my podcast. People on my podcast became my friends.
Right.
So that was a little weird. I found them because that's in my network. I needed someone to talk to, and I figured, okay, if this is a new podcast, I need a guest. Who is someone I want to listen to? Okay, let me target my family and friends, because that's what I want to listen to my podcast.
Right.
How am I going to do that? I should get on my family and my friends.
Mm.
And then professionally, I use my network. You talk to coworkers.
And either way, bottom line, folks, you can't be afraid to ask.
Yeah,
you gotta leverage your warm network, so to speak, both personally and professionally. Starting off, unless you're gonna do a solo podcast and talk to yourself, this is the cost. You got to get out there and you got to network and you got to find people to talk to. Otherwise, again, solo podcast.
Yeah.
Which is cool too.
Which is also cool. But guests are great because guests, at least in theory, will be inclined to share the show with their social media following, their friends, their clients, what have you.
And it legitimizes you.
It does.
Because now someone wants to talk to you.
Mm-hmm.
In theory, anybody can get in front of the mic and talk about a particular topic, and maybe it catches on. But when you have someone else coming onto the show to talk to you about a particular topic, particular thing, career, professional, personal, it legitimizes the show, I think, on a different level.
Guests are going to help you get noticed.
Yeah,
for sure. So go to
social media factor.
Go to LinkedIn. Look for someone you want to be interested in. If you are someone who wants to interview young entrepreneurs, because you're also a young entrepreneur, go on LinkedIn and type in entrepreneur. See what you can find. Connect with them, message them. Sometimes you'll get ignored. Sometimes you'll get a yes. Sometimes you'll get a no thank you. Sometimes you'll get a hey, I'll pass, but I think you should talk to this person. You never know. Facebook groups are also great. Moxie Ann, the singer for Talking with Tarashuk, I was just looking through one of the Facebook groups I'm in, just specifically for podcast guests, where they're like, hey, there is her manager. It's like, hey, she's got a new single coming out next month, and she's looking to do press. Who wants to interview her? I was like, me. I do. So I commented on the post. I messaged him. I got his email, scheduled it, had her on, did the podcast, and she was phenomenal. I had a great time with her. She was a lot of fun. So yeah, use social media, and also ask your guests. One thing I'll always ask my guests is like, hey, if you know someone else who would want to be a guest, connect me with them. If I go, ooh, that's interesting, I'll talk to them. And that's pretty much my thing. Asking guests to open their network to you can be greatly beneficial.
And I'd like to kind of add one more thing.
Please.
People, don't be afraid to ask, because it's no surprise. People love talking about themselves.
They do.
They love really talking about themselves. Like, oh, you're in consulting. Tell me about it. What does that entail? What do you do? People go, oh, put their feet up on the table and start telling you everything about it. People love talking about themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So, don't be afraid to ask somebody to do something they already want to do.
But to be fair, there is downsides to guests where it is more work, right? It is more work on you to book the guests, to schedule with the guests, having a Calendly or doing it manually via Gmail or Google Calendar or whatever Outlook, whatever calendar you use. It can be a little time consuming. It can be a little taxing. Some guests just won't share your stuff for whatever reason. They're busy, or they didn't like the podcast, or they just don't want to. Or they'll just engage on your post. They won't make a post of their own. You can't control people. So you could have high hopes for a guest and not get the return you're looking for. That happens. Also, quality of guests. At the beginning, I was willing to talk to pretty much anybody because I didn't know what I liked. And that's some advice I would give you if you're just starting. Talk to pretty much anybody. And then as you go on, become more selective. Like first talking with Tarashuk, I was like, oh, I'll talk to anybody, right? I just want to get content out there. But then it's like, all right, this particular kind of person can be very, very hit or miss. So let's say you want to do an interview show. You got a current events show or a baseball show, right? Let's do sports. You got a football show, right? And you're a diehard Cowboys fan. and you want to do a sports show, and you find a guest, and you don't know that he's, I don't know what the Cowboys, the Eagles? Let's say the Eagles. They're rivals with the Eagles. And he's a diehard Eagles fan, and you're just yelling at each other for 45 minutes, right? Sometimes you got to vet your guests. So, sometimes you got to do a little bit of homework on your guests. It's a smart call to sometimes have a 10-minute call before you even schedule a podcast to see if there's chemistry there. There was one person I reached out to, was like, hey, do you want to be a guest? He's like, yeah, sure, let's have to do a 10-minute call. We talked for 10 minutes, and it was the most awkward 10 minutes of my life, and I passed. I was like, this would not be a good podcast.
Pre-qualify.
Yep. The problem with guests is if you have a guest, a show focused around guests, there's also pressure on you to book those guests a few weeks at a time so you don't miss a week, right? Because the main thing with podcast releases, as we're getting into is further on this course, is consistency. You want to consistently release your content, and if you don't have guests, you don't have a show. Now, there is a way out of that, but it puts a lot more pressure on you, and sometimes the risk isn't always worth the reward. And then you got to ask a question, all right, is this guest going to be in person, or is it going to be remote, or are you going to do a little bit of both? In my opinion, in person is always better. I would much prefer having guests in this studio in Montclair, New Jersey, Cube Recording Studios, because I know the sound is going to be better. There's going to be less issues from a technical standpoint because I'm not the one handling it. Christian is.
Appreciate that.
I know I'm going to have a better conversation because I'm looking at them in the eye, right? We're right here, right in front of us. It's easy to get sidetracked when you're doing remote. It's kind of harder to pick up on social cues or body language. It's harder to pick up when they're done with their thought. It's harder to interrupt and move the conversation along.
Sometimes there's latency too.
Sometimes there's latency. They have bad internet.
They stop. You start talking before they stopped, or vice versa, with Zoom calls and things of the like.
Mm-hmm. Mm. So there's always issue there, technical standpoint, finding guests, but either or, you can always do both. I do both. I do a little bit of everything because I'm a mixed bag, but a podcast. And then once you get a guest, congratulations, you got a guest. You have 1 week to prep for it. So how do you do that? Well, what I do is I make a list of questions. What I found is I write a bio, I ask my questions, and by that I formulate the podcast in my head. And I found including the bio, if you go a page of questions a little longer, it'll get to about an hour, at least for me. And I'm going to show you right now what those questions look like. So let's take a look. Ladies and gentlemen, hello, and welcome to the clip of how I formulate my guest questions and how I populate this. Now, you can be watching this clip on YouTube and its individual form, which thank you. Welcome, like, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff. Or you're watching the full video also on YouTube, and we cut away to the clip. We'll be right back to that full podcast in just a second. But first, I am here to show you how I formulate my questions for my guests, the basic structure I use. I use this philosophy and structure for all of my guests. So, for this example, we're going to use Talking with Tarashuk, episode number 40, with Kirsten Wagner, who is the author of the beautiful game, English for Football or Soccer. So the first thing I do is obviously have the name of the podcast up the top with the guest as well as then her title or their title. Put that here as well. I have a bio, so I know who it is I am talking to, so I can introduce them to my audience. Now, I literally read this word for word on the podcast while I am recording. So you, the audience, know exactly who it is, as well as the guests. They feel pretty good about being introduced. I have gotten many a compliment of how well I do at introducing guests, so I take pride in that. Now, for this particular guest, she actually provided me with most of this bio. If a guest provides you with the bio, use it, or at least use some of it. I did use some of this. Some of this I wrote myself. Some of this I took directly from her. So I thought that was the best way to go about things. If you want to use the one they give you, use one they give you. If you want to use one you write yourself, write one yourself. Honestly, it really doesn't matter. Make up your own mind is what I say. But from there, I always start with just general questions. You know, who are you? What do you do? What's your life story? Just most basic of stuff. And then kind of introducing what the rest of the stuff I'm going to talk about is. That's why I just put it under general. Now, for Kirsten, her particular thing is that she is an author. She wrote a book. She loves soccer, and she's an English business trainer. So That's great. I have English business trainer as my act 1. I have soccer and World Cup as act 2, because me not being a big fan of soccer, I had to find something to tie it into that was personal for me, because it's a Talk My Tarashuk podcast. The P stands for personal in my podcast acronym. And then I had a book, which is, what she would like to talk about. So I started with English business trainer because that is her job. That is what she does. And from there, I can tie that into her book as well as the World Cup in soccer. So this is his general introduction. This is foundational, who she is as a professional. Why is she an expert? Why am I talking to her? Why does she matter? She gets to prove her expertise with, strong communication skills. This is her phrase. I put this question down because it's something that connected with me. My job is to make your life easier and not get in the way. That is something as a producer I live by. I want to make your job in your life as simple as possible. And her motto is helping people do their job better. So that's great. Just basic questions around communication. The biggest communications problem you see in international companies. And I had a question, what does international mean? Is it New York versus Tokyo offices, or is it between two different companies? I just kind of make that distinction. That's something I wanted to know. And these are just questions used as guidelines. A lot of the questions I actually asked on the podcast, I would ask, like, what kind of businesses do you work with? And then from there, I ask more in-depth questions based upon her answer. I build. I'm not a talking head. I don't just ask questions. I communicate, I engage, and I build upon the question I ask. Now, these questions are just, again, guidelines back to center. If we kind of lost something to talk about, I go and come back to my questions and ask another questions. If the conversation kind of dies, I go back to these questions. Sometimes I don't even ask all the questions. Sometimes I ask too many questions. Sometimes I write too many questions. So I kind of get a feel for how the podcast is going, and cut questions on the spot. So from there, talk about soccer and World Cup. I did some research on the World Cup and asked questions about my research. How does a country get selected? Yada, yada, yada. Cultural impact. Can I connect it to the Olympics? This is a thought I have. So I see, okay, does she agree with me? Does she disagree with me? That could be good conversation. How did she get into soccer? Make it personal to her. And then I connected language, because she is an English business trainer, connected language to soccer, which is also the theme of her book. So it kind of flows 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, all into the other. And I do find that typically one page of questions is about an hour of recording. So keep that in mind when you're formulating questions with your guests. So I hope this helps you in your journey to having guests and formulating your questions. But thank you for listening to the clip. Like, share, subscribe, follow for more content on how to start your podcast. And if you're listening to the full video, we're going to hop back right now.
So I hope that helps you, right? Like seeing the questions I ask, how I formulate the thought, the idea of, I start with a general question. Who are these people? What I want to talk about? And then kind of like if they're selling a book or if they have like a new show coming out or whatever, kind of get stuff that they would want to talk about, something interesting, wrap it up and go home. But that comes with doing research. So how do you do research on your guest? Well, I ask them. Like when I schedule the interview, I go, hey, send me links to whatever you will find interesting. This can be your website. If they have a website, give me your website. Social media channels, give me your social media channels. If you've been guests on other podcasts, give me those podcasts. I will go and listen to those podcasts. I will scrum through the website, look for things I find interesting. So to go and go, ooh, I can answer that. There was one podcast I spoke to an author, and in his email, he gave me a fun fact that he went to clown college. So I was like, that's awesome. We talked about 20 minutes about him going to clown college. So I never would have known that if I didn't ask and he didn't put it in that email. So shout out to that guy. Another thing you want to do is check spelling in their title, right? So like if I was going to interview Christian, I would ask for the spelling of his last name and the title he wants me to use. Like if he has a podcast, he could want to be, host of the Cube podcast. Or if he wants to promote his business, lower third can be founder, Cube Recording Studios. Or if it's a longer podcast, I can do both. Lower thirds can have multiple titles. Calendar invites. Make sure you send out calendar invites to your guests with the Zoom info if it's remote, the address if it's in person, or you can do it on Calendly and they can schedule it themselves. Once you're in person, whether it's remote or in person, you want to double check one more time the spelling and pronunciation
of their names. I am awful at pronouncing names. I will ask them 3 or 4 times, still get it wrong, and then apologize 3 or 4 times. But it's always good to ask. Like my last name, Tarashuk. I have heard every which way you can mispronounce my name. But if someone doesn't ask, I'm going to sit back and watch and correct them. It's going to be really funny. Make sure they know what they're getting into. So, for example, say you are interviewing a lawyer, right, for your podcast, and you want to make sure that the guest knows at least somewhat what you're going to talk about. Some guests might want the list of questions beforehand. That's up to you whether or not you want to give it to them. If one person did ask me for a list of questions, and I gave it to them. I typically don't like doing that, but she was a good friend, and actually my former boss. Then she left the company. So I did give her the questions out of respect, but most people I probably wouldn't. I'll give them, hey, like, I want to cover A, B, C, and if we have time, D. So that's totally up to you. But back with the lawyer, there's some things I probably won't be able to talk about since confidentiality, or if it's an ongoing case, and if you kind of formulate your podcast on an ongoing case, you're going to get a lot of no comments and you don't have a podcast. So you want to make sure you tell your guest what it is you're talking about so they can be prepared, so you can be prepared, and there's no surprises. You know, I think it's very disrespectful. Whereas, like, say you're interviewing an economist, right? And you ask them about a scandal that may or may not have gone on with, like, a bank that they may or may not have worked for in the past, right? You don't want to catch them on their toes and they kind of just go, put them in an awkward position. It's just rude and disrespectful. You shouldn't do that. If they're in studio, you want to prep them for setup time and breakdown time. Like, listen, Chris, we want to schedule the podcast for 7. We're probably going to start recording at 7:30 because about a half hour for set up the equipment and testing and make sure everything's good to go. We'll get you out of here by 9 o'clock, right? Like stuff like that. Christian, what do you got?
Yeah, that's definitely the type of stuff that you want to, inform your guest of. Give them some understanding of what kind of questions are going to be coming their way. Be professional, be on time. Explain to them if, you don't want them to come in thinking that they're going to be just getting on the mic and going if there's a setup time.
Mm-hmm.
For us, for example, when we bring guests in here, the angles are pretty much set up, but, people sit a little bit differently or a different height. That type of stuff, angles need to be adjusted. You definitely need to be cognizant of telling people that before they come in.
As I just adjust myself.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. You're a regular in Cube recording studios, yet there are sometimes some variations that need to be angles and adjustments that need to be made.
Yeah.
Not to mention, sometimes there's a client in here that's doing something completely different from when you come in. So, have the setup built into the time. Let the person know. Inform them of any questions. As you said, do not offend your guests. Do not try to catch them off guard and ambush them. That's not cool. Don't do that. But yeah, I'm just kind of reiterating what you said. I agree with you completely.
Also, ask them if there's anything they want to talk about.
And right? I like the way you put it. Ask them, if you're not going to tell them what you're going to ask them, is there anything that you don't want?
Yeah. Anything I cannot talk about that's off limits.
Right.
Well, like if I had Jeff Bezos on the podcast, I don't know why that would never happen. I don't think I even want to. But if I did, I'm like, so Jeff, I heard you want to tell on our bridge about the yacht, right? In the Netherlands. Why'd you want to do that? He'd probably be like, yeah, let's not talk about that. And I can make the decision to go, all right, I'm going to pass on the interview, or I can go, okay.
Or give them, let them know that if there's anything you're uncomfortable, if I ask you anything and you're uncomfortable with, we'll just move on.
Yeah. You can always say no comment. I do like to throw the caveat. I do like to surprise my guests just a little bit, because I do encourage my guests to ask me questions as well, because my podcast is very conversational. It's very discussion based. I make that clear up front with them as well. I was like, hey, listen, I encourage you to ask me questions during the podcast as well, to kind of keep me on my toes. And then at the end of the podcast, the final question always goes to the guest. That's just something I thought of to kind of hold the podcast together as a gimmick, which I think is hilarious. Personally, I love it. So let's do a practice run, Christian.
All right. Yeah.
So we're gonna do a mock. here's how you should pretty much handle it. So, Christian, you were going to be my guest. Play stupid for me.
All right, I need another name.
Let's call you, Michael Looper.
Michael Looper.
Michael Looper.
My friends call me Mike.
My friends call you Mike?
Yeah.
All right, so Michael, pleasure to meet you. Thank you for being in the podcast. This is Cube Recording Studios. Hope you like the place.
Yeah, it's really nice. Call me Mike.
Call you Mike? All right, so I just want to make sure. So the lower third, you want it to be Michael, and last name is Looper, Loopper. Correct. No, 2 P's, not 1 P.
2 P's.
2 P's, all right.
That'd be Loper.
Loper. All right, so Looper. And your title is author of Looper with 2 P's. That's the name of your book?
Yes.
Awesome. So I think today we're going to talk about your book, your writing process, how you came up with it, why the title, and, what made you want to write your memoirs. That all sound good?
Sounds good to me.
Anything that's off limits, anything I shouldn't talk about? Like, I know recently you got a divorce going on. Anything like, is that cool?
Yeah, I'd like to, we could dive into a little bit, but I like to shy away from the personal stuff.
Okay. If I ask you anything that crosses the line, feel free to put my foot in my mouth and just tell me this. I'm not comfortable talking about that. I won't push you and we'll move on.
Sounds good.
All right, so we're going to record for about an hour. Typically, I say an hour, but if we happen to go longer, is it cool if you go longer? Do you have extra time or do you have a hard out? If you have a hard out, I'll respect that time and I'll make sure. If you say we're out by 7:15, we'll be out by 7:15 on the dot. I give you my word.
Okay, yeah, I'm good to go. I got a little bit of extra time after.
All right, perfect. Wonderful. All right, so I think we're pretty much good to go. We're going to get started, and then whenever we're ready, you hear a brief intro and we're good to go.
All right.
Right? So, yeah, that's pretty much how you should prep your guests. I mentioned what we're going to talk about. I asked them if there's anything off limits. I made some stuff up. Most of the time, guests are going to be really cool. They'll say they're an open book. I've never asked a question the guest didn't want to answer that I wasn't told beforehand. Right? And it can be multiple reasons. And that's it. So that's guests. A little long one on guests, but guests are very, very important to a podcast. So my personal choice, as you can imagine, is I like to pick and choose a little bit of everything. I am very eclectic with my podcast. I personally like to be the main host. I think that's what I'm good at. But there's also times where I like being a second mic, where I don't have that much responsibility. I just get to go on the podcast and have fun. I like having guests. I like not having guests. The only thing I really don't like is having a solo show. Podcasts are personal with your audience, and they feel like they know you. So as a host, it's important to open up and open yourself up, whether it's a character you're playing or your real self, or your real self as a character. And there's plenty of dynamic duos. Think of Opie and Anthony, if you're familiar with New York Satellite Radio, or Mike and Mike in the Morning from Sports Radio, or comedians podcasts like Anthony Jeselnik and someone else has a podcast. Andrew Schultz and Akash Singh, they have a podcast together. King's Wings podcast, we have a podcast together. If you and your co-host have good chemistry, your audience is gonna pick it up, and your audience is gonna have a favorite. And just hope it's you. But like I said, you don't need your podcast. You don't need to stick to one of these things. You can mix and match. Say you're an interview show who interviews millennials and how they are with money. You're going to get a very wide range of guests there. People who know nothing about money and you can educate them, or people who know a lot about money and they educate you, or someone who's just like you who's kind of just in the middle. Now, say you have a guest cancel last minute and you don't know what to do. You're very anal about releasing shows every Thursday, 1:00 in the afternoon, and it's Tuesday and your guest cancels. What are you going to do? Now, if you have a guest format and you're very stuck to that format and you've never done a solo show, you can skip the week. You can do a solo show, or you can try and find another guest real quick, have a previous guest on, or you can do what I would call the expert podcast, where if you're sticking to that analogy of a millennial money podcast, you would have a list of questions related to your podcast, and you ask them and you answer them. It's a way for you to give advice to your audience from your point of view. And this can work with sports. So if you have a basketball guest cancel last minute, You can just ask yourself questions about basketball. Do I think that the Sixers are going to win the East this year? I think the Sixers are a good team, yada, yada, yada. You can go to social media and have them ask you questions. This can work in medicine, law, or literally any other podcast. Just be prepared to do a combo of a solo show with guests, co-host, or what have you. And if you already do a mixed match in this, that, and the other, or this, that, and the third, as Christian would say, you can have these backup plans. And you can pretty much just go however you want to do it. All right. So from there, you have your host, you have your co-host, you have the idea that you want to do guests, but you're also willing to do just banter between the two of you and your co-host. Most important question. What am I going to talk about? That's really the big question of your podcast. I get all the time. What should I talk about? Now, the answer is anything. Literally anything. You can do a podcast on Slinkies for all I care. I don't know how you would do it, but you could do it. Now, if you're a business, it's easy to talk about your business, your story, your mission. Like Christian, you could do like a 5-episode podcast on just your business, Cube Recording Studios, all the services
Absolutely.
you do. So like how do you think you would plan that out?
How would I plan that out? I would plan it out. I would probably split it into 2 topics, the business side and then the audio and musical side of things. And I could explain, there could be how-tos, how to set up the process I do when a client calls the studio and I answer the phone. What do I say? Of course, I don't just wing it. I know I've done it enough times to know exactly what I'm going to say, what kind of questions I'm going to ask, how I'm going to qualify them based off their project, what their needs are, what their budget is, what their time frame is, and if all goes well, what next steps are. How do you get in here? What's the address? Are there files that need to be sent over? So there's a lot of different things I could talk about. And then once they get in, how do I set up? How do I pick a microphone for them if they're going to be singing? Things like this. After we record it, what's my process for recording? What do we do first? What do we do last? What order do you do things? There's a lot of different areas that I could attack it. Production. Do you need production? What's that process going to look like? That's going to look different from somebody who comes in and already has music.
Yeah.
But very all-encompassing about the business, and I guess the main topics would be the business side of things and logistics, and the music side of things. How do those things operate?
You could also interview your clients, right? You can use it as a way to get people in the door. So say you have a musician who wants to work with you, they're a little hesitant, you should be like, okay, how about this? Come to the studio, let's do a podcast. You and me, 101, we'll promote your music, right? We'll put your branding in there. See how this Cube Recording Studios is in this window? That's going to be your logo instead, or your album cover, or,
right.
Whatever you want to do in there.
Oh, okay. So that's what you mean. Not just an informative podcast, but any type of podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or a lot of times I do studio footage, or I'm in the process of building up a freestyle rap podcast where, artists from, different areas, they come to the studio and, they're just sitting at a table with a bunch of other people who have the same similar skill set and, going back and forth. Or like you said, interviewing artists. What's their story? How did they get to have the skills and, be wanting to pursue a music career?
It's networking. Right,
Yeah.
And that person could be like, he could come in, see a studio. You see how good of a job you do with it.
I could do one on audio engineering.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many things that are related to, the studio.
It tells the story of your business, your story, your mission, your expertise. It's a channel to get your voice out there. It's a way to get new business.
Talk about whatever, your topic, but I'm sure your topic is probably, it starts off ambiguous.
Yes.
And then just like tree branches, you're like, okay, well, I could talk about this thing. I could talk about this thing. I could talk about this thing. Or I could talk about all of them.
Yeah.
Or you could pick one.
That's a good way of looking at it. Start broad and get specific.
Yes.
But if you do have a business, right, your business doesn't need to be what your podcast is about, really.
Right. It doesn't have to be direct. Like I with the freestyle rap podcast. This isn't like, 106 in Park Freestyle Friday. Like that's not what we do here, but it's an aspect that might be attractive and is somewhat related, but it's not direct. It's not like I'm getting on the podcast and be like, these are my services and this is what I do, call the number on the screen.
Right.
Way too direct.
It's just an ad. At this point, it's just an ad.
It's like you're selling me something. No, I'm just showing you something that is somewhat related. And if it turns into the goal isn't for me to generate business.
Right.
It's just to give you content.
Right.
Right.
But, if you have a business, like say you run a hardware store, right? And you sell, knives, hammers, nails, nail guns, duct tape, electric tape, whatever. But you love outdoors. You love nature. You love fishing. You could do a fishing podcast, right? Like, no, this lure is the best. It gets the best guppies, the fattest guppies. Let me tell you about this guppy, right? You could do a podcast on that, and you could run ads from your hardware store on that podcast. Because fishing and hardware, it could be somewhat related. Doesn't even have to be related. Like, the best example I use is Conrad Thompson. I love talking about this guy. So if you're asking yourself, who is that? Not important. What Conrad does is he sells home mortgages. That is what he does. He is like a mortgage lender, whatever it's called. I don't know. I've never bought a mortgage, so I don't know. But he sells mortgages. But he's also a podcaster who talks about wrestling. And he has like 4 or 5 different wrestling podcasts over the past 7 or 8 years. He has managed to create multiple podcasts with some of the biggest names in wrestling. He did one with Ric Flair. He did one with Eric Bischoff. He does one with Tony Schiavone. He does one with Bruce Pritchard. He does one with Jeff Jarrett. He does one with Arn Anderson. And he might be done with another one, right? But my point is, he had that connection, right? He had that network. He just happened to know Ric Flair through radio. And he also married his daughter, so that was pretty cool. Ric Flair's the guy who goes, woo, on TV. But he did these podcasts, super entertaining, took off like wildfire, has a massive audience of millions of downloads over the past, tens of millions of downloads over the past years across all the podcasts. He runs ads on his mortgage business on that podcast and makes a killing. Absolute killing. And wrestling has absolutely nothing to do with his business. He also runs ads on a bunch of other things, and he makes them entertaining and engaging. But he is a businessman who has a podcast that has nothing to do with his business, but applies to the audience who listens to that podcast, like home mortgages. That's something that I can apply to. You can put a home mortgage ad on any kind of podcast because people will always be buying homes, at least hopefully. So pretty much, if you're trying to find a discussion topic, what do you like? What are you passionate about? Sports? Fitness? Religion? Movies and entertainment? TV and entertainment? Zodiac signs? You can talk about anything. And the analogy I use with Conrad is it's kind of the inverse of a business podcast for a business. This kind of does the inverse of a business, meaning you are starting a podcast as a business. Your podcast can then turn into a business in it of itself. And whichever one you choose is totally fine. But first, decide what you want to talk about. Find your niche as well as your target audience. Another thing you might want to think about is, what does your audience want to hear? Or what might they want to hear? So let me use an analogy of a baseball podcast. That's very vague. That's very broad. You can do what Christian said and kind of cover all of them, all those branches. Or you can kind of think more niche, try to find the hole in the market. Are you going to...
It's always better to go niche.
It is, but podcasting, it is better to go niche. And then if you're kind of stuck, go a little more broad. Like if you want to have things to talk about, you can go more broad. So you could follow a specific team. You could follow the Phillies if you love the Phillies. Philly fans are freaking crazy, right? They'll listen to it. Or maybe that Christian like you're Puerto Rican, even though some people don't believe it, but you are.
Yeah, apparently I'm not Puerto Rican. I got to speak Spanish for them to know. You could
do profiles on Puerto Rican players. Or you could go with Latin American players, like Dominican players. Dominican players are all over the MLB, right? Like you could cover players from past and present and like the Negro Leagues up until currently. Like prospects, he is like the biggest prospect coming from Puerto Rico or Dominican Republic. That's very niche. People would love that, especially internationally. Or you can cover the MLB as a whole. Excuse me. You know, what kind of audience would that attract? What might they want to hear in addition to what you have to say? And if you find that audience, then you got to find advertisers to target towards that audience. And then once you have that topic, what I would do is go search on Spotify, go search on iTunes, go search on Google, and search that genre. The purpose of this is to figure out what works and what doesn't work. So if you find a popular podcast, listen to it. What do you think works for this podcast? Why is it popular? Again, with baseball, someone like John Boy Media, he is phenomenal because he does in-depth analysis of baseball. He takes a lot of time and a lot of effort in his videos as well as his regular podcast. So that's why that's successful. It's attention to detail. But do that and find out how you can be different. If it's a financial podcast covering news, the latest finance news, maybe you can switch it up. Talk about historic moments in the stock market. You know, find a hole in the market. Recently, at least as of recording this, we had the anniversary of the 2008 housing market crash, right? You could take a look at that day in history and see how it compares to the current housing market we have today. Or you could take a look at 1971 when we went off the gold standard and see what happened since we left the gold standard in the U.S. economics. So stuff like that. Find your niche. Find that hole in the market and plug it with your podcast. Right, Christian?
Well said.
Well said. Let me take a breath here.
Yeah, that was a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot of talk wasn't serious.
I mean, kind of on the note with being unrelated, this podcast, you know, Shot Here or the Unknown Unnamed Nonsense has nothing to do with, you know, like music.
Yeah.
You know, we do podcasts here for sure, but you know, when people think of a recording studio, the first thing they don't think of is podcast typically, or voice acting. And you know, the show that we do with you, talking with Tarashuk, Mr. Tarashuk himself, is seemingly unrelated, but it's content.
Mm-hmm.
So,
all right, one of my favorite things to talk about: podcast length. And I say it's my favorite because it's the dumbest thing to talk about, in my opinion. But people are going to ask, so I'm going to answer. So be ready. How long should my podcast be? Well, the answer is however long it takes you to get your point across. It's that simple. The most successful podcast in the world is Joe Rogan, and it's 3.5 hours on average. And he's done almost 1,900 of them as of recording this. You know, other podcasts are 5 minutes, also very successful. Typically, the answer you're going to hear most often is between 30 and 60 minutes. Now, that can depend on the topic. People say that because it's the average time of a commute, and a commute is probably the most popular time people listen to podcasts. So, if you're just starting, I would give the advice between 30 to 60 minutes, but don't treat that as gospel. There is no right or wrong answer as to how long your podcast should be. It should take however long it takes you to get your point across. Every time I have a guest, I ask them if they can go longer, if we go longer, because if I'm in the flow of things and it's a great conversation, I don't want it to stop. And it shouldn't stop because you have this unknown, arbitrary time frame. You know, people kind of get stuck, in my opinion, on that traditional media. I use that in air quotes again, of like, you know, Nickelodeon has a 30-minute time slot for all their shows. It can't be longer. Actually, it's 22 with ads. You know, NBC has their news segment for 2 hours. Can't be longer. We got to get to Survivor next, right? Like, podcasting isn't like that. Who determines how long your podcast should be? The free market of ideas. Who determines how long your podcast should be? How long it takes your audience to listen to it? Does your an experiment, right? Do a podcast that's 15 minutes. See how it does with the numbers. Do a podcast that's 2 hours. See how it does with the numbers. You know, mix and match. I mentioned Dan Carlin earlier. The guy is the #1 history podcast in the world, at least in my opinion. It's one of the most popular. He releases probably 6 a year if we're lucky. And the podcast like 4-5 hours by himself, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's hardcore history. Chris, remember on the Talking with Tarashuk podcast, they did the most important day in human history?
Yes, I do not remember your answer though. I think it was Normandy.
No, it was World War I. So I got that question from Dan Carlin's Hardcore History because he started his 6-part series on World War I with how World War I started and what he says is the most important day in human history. And, it's a 4.5-hour podcast, and it's part 1 of 6. So altogether, the whole series is like 20 hours, give or take. And he released it over like a few years. But that podcast is massively successful, and it's super long. New York Times has something that's like 10-15 minutes daily. Also, very successful. So when it comes to show length, it's up to you.
It's up to you.
I'm sorry, there is no magic wand to tell you what it is. Sometimes you got to make your own decisions. With podcast length, in my opinion, that's one of them.
I've had people starting off like, oh, is that too long? No. It's up to you.
Yeah.
Did you get your point across?
Do you think it's too long? Yeah, then it's too long.
Yeah.
And if you're one of those people who wants it to be a concise 30 minutes, that's fine. Nothing wrong with that. I just think it doesn't matter one way or the other.
It doesn't. I mean, I do think there should be, once you decide on how long you want your podcast to be, at that point, you should try to have some consistency.
Mm-hmm.
Because, people tune in. You don't want to have something that's an hour and a half and then they come back for more and it's 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Or the other way around. But having more and then less, you don't want to disappoint.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just find what works for you. There is no right or wrong answer. And if you want to go by what your audience thinks is best, do that. If you want to go by what you think is best, do that. If you're good enough, people listen to you for 2 hours. If you're not, they won't.
Market demands.
Market demands. I mean, podcasting is the free market of ideas. It really is. It's one of the last places where the free market is steady and strong, and it's not going anywhere. So with that being said, rant over. Sorry. Podcast name and logo. What should I call my podcast? These are fun. I like naming people's podcasts. I can come up with some pretty crazy ones. I think Talking with Tarashuk came up with, I was on the phone with Jared, and I had the opportunity to interview Dr. Phil Riccobono, who was the first guest for the Talking with Tarashuk podcast. And at that time, I was doing the Ambiguous Podcast Solutions, which is the podcast where I or a member of the APS team interviews other podcasters to talk about their podcast and, what they're looking for, what they do, what their podcast is about. It's a networking tool, yada, yada, yada. And I was like, Jared, this guy doesn't have a podcast. Can I just put on that feed? And he was like, no, because that's not what the podcast is about. And I'm just like, well, I guess I'll just create another one. I'll call it Talking with Tarashuk. I don't know. And that's literally how it came about. I kid you not. That is exactly how I got the name for Talking with Tarashuk. Bottom line, don't overthink this. Your podcast name should have something to do with what you're talking about. Duh. It should have a meaning and story behind it. For example, I'm very proud of this example I wrote up on the top of my head. If you have a podcast about comic books, you can call it the Kapow Podcast. You're like, Kapow! So, the story, stereotypical Kapow, used in comic books when someone gets hit. It's short, sweet, and it's relatable.
I think Bam Wham Zam's better.
Bam Wham Zam? That's another one. That's a good one too. Bam Wham Zam. Now, as when I wrote this like a year and a half ago, maybe a little short, maybe not as long as that, I Googled it. That podcast did not exist. If it still exists, take it. You're welcome. It's yours. The Kapow Podcast, talking all about comic books. But you get the point. Short, sweet, it's relatable. Talking with Tarashuk, I'm Will Tarashuk, you talk with me. Typically, things to avoid. Don't just use your name. Don't call your podcast the Greg Skinner Show. Sorry, Greg. no one knows who you are. And as of the first episode, no one really cares. Apologies to all the Greg Skinners out there.
Where did you get this name?
I just made it up. I made it. It's in my head with Michael Looper. The only with two P's.
You have ERs in all of your names.
Yep. The only exception for this is if you're famous or if you're well known in the industry. You know, Jon Stewart has a podcast called The Problem with Jon Stewart, which makes sense because Jon Stewart is a celebrity.
Jon Stewart is Jon Stewart.
Jon Stewart's Jon Stewart, right? The name says itself, right? Like a Joe Rogan Experience. When he first started, he was the Fear Factor guy and the comedian. You know, it's famous enough. You know, if Logan Paul did the Logan Paul podcast, even though he has impulsive, silly, but it works. You know, talking to Tarashuk's a little different, in my opinion, because it's my last name. It's not my first name. It's not like talking with Will Tarashuk. Talking with Tarashuk kind of rolls off the tongue. So maybe a little hypocritical, but I think it's a little different. The one exception to that is if the name is already taken, you could still use it. So, for example, if you have like a relationship podcast, like boyfriend, girlfriend, and you want to talk about breakups and how to deal with breakups, you call it the Breakup Podcast. Most likely that's taken, but the Breakup Podcast with Will Tarashuk will definitely be available. And as long as the logo looks a little bit different or looks different enough, you don't use the same color scheme, you should be just fine.
And that's the exception.
That's the exception. Now, there's also an exception to that exception, which is an exception to the other exception. That will not work if the name is already trademarked. So, for example, you could not do the Coca-Cola podcast with Will Tarashuk because Coke is trademarked. It's a trademarked product.
It's very trademarked.
Right? You get sued really quick. So, don't do that. After you have the name, think of a logo or a rough cut for a logo. Basically, it should have these 4 points. Be easy to read. Have the name of the podcast. Duh. Like, you know, see Cube Recording Studios? It's easy to read, even when it's small. Has the name front and center. Has a single focal image related to the topic. The record, the keyboard, and the microphone. In a box, in a cube. Very clever. Who designed that for you?
That would be my ex-girlfriend.
Amazing.
Yeah, she did a great job on that one.
She did do a great job. And then finally, 4, have it be a colored background, right? So black and white, good color scheme. Important things to remember. Use multiple colors. So like Christian, if I was going to critique yours, I don't know what I would do because I would probably, you know what? I would probably make I'd make the box a different color. And here's why. If you're ever going to redesign a logo, you want one to 2 primary colors, so black and white, but you also want 2 or 3 secondary colors. And because those are the colors you're going to...
I feel like the Cube Recording Studios could have been in red. Could have been in blue.
Yeah.
You know?
But you got to make it something with the black. So maybe like a yellow, like a bright yellow, or a teal.
Or, you know, cardboard colored.
Yeah, cardboard colored.
Because it's kind of like, you know, musical items in a
cardboard box.
In a cardboard box.
Yeah, and written in red.
Yeah, maybe.
That would have worked.
You know?
And the point is, right,
I was going for something simple, but
it is simple. But you take those colors, the black, the white, let's use your example. The black, the white, the red, and the brown. And all of those are going to be used for your graphics package. So, as you can see here, Talking with Tarashuk logos. I'm also going to put the Talking with Tarashuk logo up here. Yep, there it is. You can see the orange. You can see the blue on the glasses. You can see the tan on the skin. You can see a little streak for the gray, the brown for the hair, the blue on the width. All of those are used in my lower thirds. It's the same color. Different colors, whether it's the orange and the white. The font is usually that teal blue. And my animations are usually a combo of the orange or the tan. Right? Also the fonts. Make sure you know what the font is. So, Chris, I hope you know what the font is for the Cube and the recording studios. You want to make sure those fonts are saved on your computer. Because look at this lower third again. The fonts is the same font as my logo. And I use this for like my call to actions. So when I do like my subscribe on YouTube or follow on Instagram, or like us on Facebook. I don't think I made a Facebook one, actually. I probably should do that. I used the color scheme for that logo. So like, here's the YouTube red. I used the red and white, and the font on this lower third is called Playfair Display, because that is the font I used in my logo. And that is going to be used across everything. All of my lower thirds, all of my graphics. Like on Talking with Tarashuk, the banner lower third, you can see that right here, right across the bottom. Look at that question. The font, Playfair Display, the orange, it's a gradient. Same orange as my logo, right? So think about logos as branding. Also, if you're designing a website, same thing. Use that color scheme for the background, the font color, the font, the color, the font of your heading and paragraphs. It will be uniform across everything to make your podcast look that much better to your audience, yourself, advertisers, and literally anyone in between. So I'm going to show you what my webpage looks like for Talking with Tarashuk. Let's take a look at how that looks, and I'll break it all down for you as we go through it. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. My name is Will Tarashuk. I am the founder of Ambiguous Podcast Solutions, and I am showing you my webpage for my podcast, the Talking with Tarashuk podcast. I'm going to break you down why exactly I did this, how I did it, the color scheme, and how it impacts everything I do with branding and my logo. So let's start at the top. This really is my logo right here. It's my face. It is a vector image of me. See, here I am right here. How cute I am. With my gray streak, all natural, I swear. The font, the color scheme. If you notice throughout this page, the color scheme and the fonts are the exact same as what I use in my logo. There are a few exceptions with this color. It's close to the tan in the hair. This orange is the same as this orange on the top, and this pink is similar, if not the same, as the tan on my face. But the button here is the same color as my glasses. The font here is the same color as the button, which is also the same color of my glasses, which is also the same font as the lettering, which is Playfair Display. A mixed bag, but a podcast, also the same font. Different types of podcasts I have, same font, same color. We used black because black, I think this is black, not the same color as my hair. I could be wrong, but for the most part, the color scheme is the same. Playfair Display, the orange is the same. Moxie Ann, Jill Malandrino, Alan Schoenberg, their titles, same font, different color, obviously. This is their actual headshots. You can listen to these podcasts right here if you click it. My buddy Chris Scally, my fan Mr. Fretz, and my first guest ever, Phil Riccobono. The listen is the same font. Same down here, my bio, same font, the blue, same color as one of my glasses. You know, this is one of my headshots, not headshot, one of my photos from LinkedIn. So yeah, if you look at this webpage, the color scheme, the branding completely fits my logo. So when you're making your logo, keep that in mind for when you design your webpage. You want the same colors of your logo to fit your webpage. So let's go with structure and why I did it like this. So obviously, my banner, an image of me, and I believe it's called, a tagline, a mixed bag, but a podcast. So Talking with Tarashuk podcast it's a mixed bag. It's whatever I say it is. It's whatever I want to be. It's different every single week at times. So it's 3 different structures, which pretty much anything goes. Sometimes I have guests, and these guests can be a stranger, like Moxie Ann, a good friend and a colleague, as in Jill Malandrino, and my former boss, or my boss's boss, actually formerly Jill's boss, Alan Schoenberg. It could also be one of the fans of my podcast, Mr. Fretz, real name James, was one of my first fans on my wrestling podcast, the King's Rings podcast. Also, his Fretzmania podcast was started in inspiration by our podcast, the King's Rings podcast. I can't take all the credit. I had 2 amazing co-hosts with me. Also, a guest is my good friend Chris Scally, who is a co-founder of the Seething Agency with his wife Carly. And other podcasts are with my friends and family. Like this particular podcast was a podcast with my cousin Michael, where we talk about our family history and a lot of fun stuff going on there. And the third type of podcast is Anything Goes, which is the unknown, unnamed nonsense edition of the podcast where I have a giant random list of questions. And me and my co-host and my guest have fun answering them. It's ridiculous, it's serious, or it's silly. But these are my 3 types of podcasts. So I put these here to demonstrate the 3 different types of podcasts I have on this one channel. And the answer is yes. Each of these, archetypes or columns or verticals is what I'm looking for, is also going to be an individual RSS feed and an individual podcast under the Talking with Tarashuk brand. I feature my guests, again, a little bit of variety. Moxiana is a singer. Jill Malandrino is a global market supporter and also my boss as of recording this. Alan is a chief communications officer in corporate America. I did not use his company at his request because our podcast was very not much about the company he works for. So out of respect for my guest, I did that. You have to do that one day too. And then my friends, and then Phil, who actually Chris introduced me to Phil, who at the time was an MLB scout living in Japan, and my first guest on the Talking with Tarashuk podcast. So that was really cool. And then I have my bio. Here's who I am. I podcast for personal growth. That's a quote from me. It's something that's true to this day. Here's my bio, a little bit about me, my favorite episode. You have to click it and find out. Shout out to K Murphy. And then here's your RSS feed. Here's where you can listen to it. Now, you might be asking yourself, why didn't I put the actual episodes so I can listen to front and center? Now, the reason for that is because you're going to scroll and kind of be convinced, like, okay, I listened to this, and then bam, there it is. And then you can follow along like always. So that's the page. Main point of this clip is the color scheme and the structure of the web page. I'm killing 2 birds with 1 stone here. But we're going to go back to the podcast. We're almost done. We got about 15, 20 minutes left in the podcast. Thank you so much for bearing with me. And make sure to like, share, subscribe, all that fun nonsense. You're listening to the clip, listen to the full podcast, or you can listen to it, the audio version, on your way to work. Thank you all. Love you very much. Let's get back to the podcast. Not now, but right now.
I am very proud of that webpage. Shout out to my girlfriend who helped me design it. So that was awesome. Also the logo. She designed the Talking with Tarashuk logo. Now, unless you're skilled at designing logos, which clearly I am not, I have a professional create one for you. You can do it pretty cheap. Someone over here at APS can do it. Or if you know how to do it, do it. You can go on Canva, figure something out, play around a little bit. But keep it simple. Keep it sweet. Remember your color codes. Remember your font files. And use that across everything and anything. But your logo needs to be a certain size. So 3 very important things, because your RSS feed, as we covered last episode, if you know refresh what RSS feeds are, gets read through iTunes, and iTunes is pretty much a default flag bearer for the specs for an RSS feed, including the image. So iTunes has the specifications as it needs to be a JPEG, a JPG, I think is a JPEG. Chris, what's between a JPEG and JPG?
The same exact thing.
Same exact thing? So it needs to be a JPEG file or a PNG file. It needs to be between 1,500 and 1,500 pixels. That's a perfect square. And 3,000 and 3,000 pixels. So either way, it needs to be a perfect square. So if it's 2,000 by 2,000, that's fine. If it's 1,500 by 1,500, that's fine. If it's 31 by 31, that's not fine. iTunes won't read
I'd
it.
urge for PNGs simply because they're a lossless file format.
What does that mean?
That means if you increase it in size, if it's manipulated later, if it's increased in size or made smaller, it will not lose its quality.
Okay. That's good to know.
Yeah. That's not the same case for JPEGs or JPGs.
Okay. It also needs to be under 500 gigabytes in size. That's the KB.
Kilobytes.
Kilobytes. I say gigabytes? That's not a real word.
Yeah.
KB. And that's what? Like
1,000 kilobytes in a megabyte.
Right. So it's like less. It's like what, 5% of a gigabyte?
Did you say 5 KB?
Yeah.
Or no, 500, under 500.
Under 500.
Yeah, it's half or less.
Half or less. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And PNGs typically are bigger, but a 3,000 by 3,000 shouldn't be over than 500 KBs.
No. I mean, it depends, but yeah.
Yeah. I would go for 3,000 by 3,000 because it's more pixels. It just looks better. But it really doesn't matter. As long as your logo fits those parameters, iTunes will accept it. Now, if it's a good logo, iTunes won't tell you if your logo sucks. So keep that in mind. Imagine if it did.
Your logo is being rejected from the platform.
Yeah, your logo is rejected because it's just bad. Maybe they have guidelines for like profanity.
stuff like that. Honestly, I'm not sure, but if your podcast is this like an inappropriate body part, okay, fine, good luck. Podcast description and choosing categories. We're almost done here, Christian, I promise. Your podcast description answers the who, the what, the when, and the why. The what. The what, because I'm tired and doing this a while. So who are you? As an individual as well as a podcast. The what is your podcast about? What do you talk about? I put what on here twice. Why are you talking about it? And why should they listen to it? And the when. When is it released? Is it weekly? Is it monthly? Is it daily? And give it time. So for Talking with Tarashuk. Talking with Tarashuk is hosted by Will Tarashuk. It is a variety podcast that ranges from interviews, nonsense, and talking to my friends and family. We talk about anything I generally find interesting. Why? Because it's fun. I enjoy podcasting. Why should you listen to it? You should listen to it if you want to learn something new, learn something about me, or if you're interested in being a guest. When is it released? It's released Wednesday mornings, 10 a.m. on the audio feed, as well as the video on YouTube, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's just the basics, and I would pretty much condense that into an actual description, which I have everywhere. Be smart with your descriptions and think of keywords to use that can be picked up by Google. Categories. iTunes has a massive list of categories. That's pretty much the standard for podcast categories. Make sure to pick 1 to 3 categories for your podcast. But I think the more detailed you go, the better. Your primary category can be business as a primary, but secondary would be investing or news or marketing. Categories are important so the algorithm knows where to put you, so it can push it out there for people to find. So don't skip that. Christian, any note on descriptions?
No, I think you covered things pretty well.
All right. Home stretch.
Home stretch,
baby. Call to actions. Where to put your call to action. So, but in the first asking, Will, what's a call to action? A call to action is exactly what it sounds like. You call on your audience to act, which means subscribe, follow, or buy. Subscribe to the podcast or newsletter. Follow on socials. Follow or subscribe to the guest, or buy a product from one of your partners and advertisers. Also, you tell them to review the podcast to help you in the algorithm. So subscribe, follow, buy, review. You can put them at the beginning, the middle, the end. I do all of them at the beginning and the end. I don't like doing them in the middle. Christian, notice we don't do any ads or plugs in the middle of the podcast.
No, we don't.
That's because I think the middle is the most important thing. It disrupts the flow.
Yeah.
And I
mean,
like,
there are people that do take that approach.
Yeah, no, nothing wrong with it.
Yeah.
It's probably honestly, it's probably the most successful to do them in the middle.
For the ad placements, yes.
Yeah.
For the attention's already captured. People are like, oh, what the hell? There's an ad right here. They watch it. They continue the show.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I do them at the beginning. Typically. At the end, you always get the plugs at the end.
Yep.
To you and the guest, always give them a chance to plug their stuff.
Well, plugs are, I think, ads and plugs are different.
Ads and plugs are different, correct? Right. But it's still a call to action.
Yes.
So it's already subscribe. I do subscribe at the beginning and the end. First thing in my cold open for the intro. We're gonna get into what that means next episode or a few episodes later. This can be included in your pre-recorded intro, your live intro, or you can do it in both. And again, I'm going to explain what all those means in a later episode. Remind your listeners to subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, your newsletter, etc. Give your guests a chance to do this as well, and you repeat at the end. First and foremost, hey, this is the podcast. Remember to go subscribe. At the end, hey, this was the podcast. Remember, go subscribe. If you liked it, here's where you can find more.
Like, comment, subscribe, share.
Like, comment, subscribe, share.
Share is important.
Following. This can be done at the beginning as well as at the end. Follow blank for more content or video content.
Follow us on TikTok for more content. Same with the guests. Give the guests their chance to find where they can follow you. If they have a newsletter, they can subscribe or follow to the newsletter. All you can do is start the podcast via graphics in lower thirds, which is something we do on podcasts, on my clips. Typically for that, lower third etiquette. For our lower thirds, our names, I do them every 15 minutes. I try to do them every 15 minutes. I'll throw up a lower third. So at the beginning of the podcast, I'll do it like right at the beginning. I'll do my intro. Welcome to Talking with Tarashuk podcast. My name is Will Tarashuk. Lower third comes up. Say it's like 90 seconds into the podcast. I will do the next one after 15:30 or 16:30. Say like Christian's talking at that time. I'll wait until I'm talking. And say it happens at 17:04. Then I wait and do it at, what's the math there? 32:04. After that. Same thing with Christian. Christian comes in a few minutes later at the beginning of the podcast. I'll put his at like maybe 3 minutes. Then I'll do it again at 18 minutes. If he's not there at 18 minutes, or say he's a little before 18 minutes, he talks at 17 minutes, I'll put it at 17 minutes. Same with the guests. Also for lower thirds, that's, follow on Instagram. Same thing. I will put it every 15 minutes. I'll switch it up.
Don't be annoying about it.
Don't be annoying about
Don't be annoying about it.
But I think every 15 minutes is a pretty good.
They're tuned in. They're
good time to do
they're
it.
Tuned in. They're listening. Oh wait. Oh, this person's Instagram, TikTok handle, any of the things.
Yeah, that's a good reminder of who they are. Like if they have multiple lower thirds, like
Right.
like for me, like I would do I could do if I'm on another podcast, I can do host of Talking with Tarashuk, or I can do founder of APS podcast, what have you. I'll do 15 minutes. I'll do the first one for Instagram. 15 minutes later, I'll do YouTube. 15 minutes later, I'll do Twitter. 15 minutes later, I'll do TikTok. And by that's the end of the podcast.
I think it's important to point out what you said. Just by saying it, you're not saying you're throwing up a paragraph of social handles all at once.
Yeah, spread them out.
Exactly.
Spread them out.
Yeah.
When I'm editing for clips, I will do one lower third per clip. Typically, if it's a shorter clip, I won't do names. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Depends on the clip. If it's a longer clip, I will. If it's a shorter clip, I won't. And then I'll do like a follow on Instagram for that one clip. And then the next clip, I'll do a follow on YouTube. And et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Switch it up. If it's a TikTok, so say I have a 10-minute clip from unknown unnamed nonsense. I'll do Instagram. For the whole clip, I'll do a follow on Instagram. And for every TikTok I cut for that clip, or a YouTube short, or an Instagram reel, I will use that follow on YouTube for the TikTok as well. The next clip, say it's a 5-minute clip, I will do subscribe on YouTube. Same thing with the shorts, the reels, and the TikToks. Follow on YouTube. And it's kind of go down the line. Ads. With ads, they can be placed at the beginning, at the end, they can be placed both, or in the middle. And you can price them out for different ad spots. So, for example, I think ads are typically 30, 45, 60 seconds. So say I had a 60-second ad in the beginning. That would probably be the most expensive since, one, it's longer, and it's right in the beginning. It's the highest probability of getting listened to. A 15-second ad spot at the end would be the cheapest, since most people don't listen to the end anyway. And it's 15 seconds, so it can be cheap. You can also throw it in the middle, if you wish, and you can price that out accordingly. So for us, Christian, like in between questions, we can go to an ad break. It's either pre-rolled, or we can do a live reading, one or the other.
Yep.
And that's that. That is your call to action placement. And that pretty much wraps up our episode. Next week, or next episode, whenever it's released, from the idea to the end product, meaning we're still in pre-production, but we're going to go over equipment. We're going to go over microphones, USB versus analog microphones. It's going to be a lot of Christian's time to shine. The glory of lav mics, different equipment like mic stands, the arm extender. This right here is an arm extender. We're going to talk about all that.
Table arm.
A desktop boom pole. Those are always fun. I believe you have one under here. Pop filters. Wind filters. Mixers. Different mixers to have. I'll bring my mixer in. Different types of mixers you can use. Interfaces. Like what a task cam is. And the different
experience level required. So if it's a beginner, you should buy this. If you're a little more regular, you can buy one of these. If you know what you're doing, you can buy one of these. Then other types of equipment like headphones, a 1/4-inch audio jack, audio splitters, and all the hardware you could need after that. We're going into software.
All of the things.
All other things. So this is going to be fun. But Christian, this was a good episode. Any final thoughts?
Yes, there was one thing that I wanted to circle back on. When you were talking about titles and categories, one thing that is important, and if you're, creating a podcast, it's likely that it will happen, is being strategic about your titles and descriptions.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a channel that's all about a particular thing, putting that word everywhere, some way, somehow, not in an annoying way, but just being clever about it, will, especially on YouTube, which is owned by Google, will put you higher up in the search. So let's say you had a podcast on how to rap podcast episode 1, how to rap podcast episode 57. You have how to rap in all of those titles. So the algorithm picks up on things like that. So be strategic with your titles, with your descriptions, with your categories. It all matters.
Yeah. That's great for individual episodes. I was also talking about like the overall podcast description.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Intro to Podcast series brought to you by Ambiguous Podcast Solutions. My name is Will Tarashuk. That's T as in Thomas. ARASHUK. All my shenanigans can be found anywhere and everywhere podcasts can be found at Talking with Tarashuk Podcast. Apple, iTunes, Spotify. Apple is iTunes, dumbass. Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, all the works. Christian, Cube Recording Studios, let's have it.
Cube Recording Studios, what's going on? It was definitely fun talking about all of the things that go into a podcast and all the different nuances. Next episode, we're going to be getting into equipment. It's you're going to be hearing a lot more from me, as Will said, talking about interfaces, microphone choice, things that are budget friendly, things that are a little bit more expensive, and everything in between to get you the sound that you're looking for, either on a professional budget or even on a lower budget. If you're doing things out of your home on a lower budget, we're going to be talking about those things: cabling, mic placement, everything you need to get going. Audio, music in the background, what you need to do, how you're going to do it, the software you're going to need to use, everything that encompasses. This is this is recorded Cube Recording Studios, cuberecordingstudios.com. That's the plug where you can find us. We can handle audio and video and everything that you see here. Back to you, Will.
We're also going to have videos on how to set all of the equipment up and how to use the equipment. I personally use the Rodecaster Pro, which is my mixer. We're going to have video tutorials on how to do that. We're going to have tutorials on how to set up the mic, how far you should be away from the mic, how much headroom is appropriate, framing up your guests.
Setting levels,
all that fun stuff, all that is coming. So a lot of the nitty-gritty, talking and long-winded stuff is pretty much done. Now we get into the fun stuff, and we'll see you all there. Till then, y'all take care.